What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for High on Life 2, sort of comedy FPS that after enjoying the first game, I knew I wanted to check out the second one here. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. I do also have to mention that I received a review key from Xbox for this, actually, and so while the game released just a few days ago, I had it in my hands a little bit longer than that. And when it comes to 100%ing the game specifically, I did want to point out that there's a lot of missable stuff, and while thankfully there are pretty much guides already up for everything, as it's not a terribly long game, there's a good chance if you're not paying attention you'll have to play through it more than once, like myself, which actually held this review up a little bit, but thankfully if you're trying to do it now, all of those guides and stuff are up. And then last but not least, before we dive fully into this, I did want to point out that I do have to spoil the first game in order to talk about this one, as it is a direct sequel actually. It takes place a couple years after the original title did, you play the same character, etc., so I do have to spoil that first game. And what's more, because of the nature of the humor and the comedy and the jokes that are, I would say, going to land best the first time you see them, you might want to consider just listening to this instead of watching it in full, because while I'm not going to talk a ton about spoilers, there will be contextual stuff in the footage almost guaranteed, so something to be aware of, I suppose. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive into the rest of this. So as I mentioned, essentially a comedy shooter. The humor is kind of the point, and I think that's an especially important thing to mention here, because if you don't enjoy the humor of this game, you probably won't enjoy the game as a whole, because that is a sizable portion of what the game is. Now, I do think there's some interesting stuff with like movement and the way the levels are set up and everything that we're going to get into, but I don't think that is a strong enough element on its own to really carry the rest of the experience. And that's before we even start talking about the myriad of technical issues we're going to get into. Outside of those things, however, the sequel here really seems like it's trying to double down on expanding some of the gameplay elements of the original title while also honing in on that same sense of humor, which already isn't going to be for everybody, I would imagine. But to give you the sort of spark notes here, basically there's an interesting game here buried under a mountain of technical problems that are going to put most people off of it. Which brings us exactly to the technical section. So first I want to talk about the things I experienced, but before I do that, I do want to point out that my full computer specs, as this is a PC channel, are always in the About section of the channel itself. I have a stronger PC than this game recommends, though its recommended settings are nothing to scoff at, as its recommended setting is actually a 4080. I mention that specifically because I do imagine some of the reports people are talking about are likely from the fact that this is simply a demanding game, but even once you get beyond that, there's a lot of problems here. For starters, this game crashed on me constantly. Like, best case scenario, it was once an hour, sometimes like once every 30-40 minutes, and while it didn't break or make anything unplayable, it got real annoying real fast. On top of that, there was also this strange, almost like screen tearing effect that would happen. I eventually was able to track down exactly what was causing this. Basically, if you use certain guns in certain places, it causes this weird, like almost sort of resolution type issue where everything gets stretched and is off. And I did notice that either not using the scanner, if that was happening, irrespective of the gun I was holding, or changing the gun I was holding would fix it. Beyond that stuff, I also got soft locked a number of times, but the game has a reload checkpoint system that allowed me to bypass those situations. But that was just the stuff I experienced personally. A quick browse through user reviews since this game has released points out that other people are having even more problems running into like just straight up hard lock situations where they can no longer continue in a full game breaking manner. So while I didn't have a good time with it, a lot of people had an even worse one. So suffice to say, the technical state of this game is simply unacceptable, especially for a game they are charging $60 for. I want people to keep that forefront in their minds as we go through the rest of this, which we're going to get into now, starting with difficulty. Now, this game is relatively easy, but it does have several difficulty modes, from story, easy, normal, to hunter mode. Now, I gotta be honest with you, if you have played an FPS in your life, probably just go ahead and jump into hunter mode. My first playthrough was on normal, and even then it was kind of a walk in the park, extraordinarily easy game. The only thing that proved even kind of a challenge here was the the fishing minigame of all things, as some of the special things you can catch there have a kind of annoying minigame attached to them. But otherwise, simply not a difficult game. There's also a checkpoint system, like I mentioned, that even occurs mid-boss fight. So if you die while fighting a boss, you don't even have to restart the whole thing or anything like that. Just so you know. Now, funnily enough, while this might not seem like the kind of game that you would have a character creator in, there is one. Of a sort, anyway. Right towards the start of the game, someone asks you to draw a picture of yourself, which serves as this game's character creation. You can go as crazy or as simple as you would like to here, but I did want to point out that the game does actually use this as your wanted poster, which comes up in just a moment. But I did want to mention that the game often has you draw stuff, like anytime they want you to sign something, etc., cross something off, the game will usually have you manually do that, and you're free to draw whatever you want, which includes exactly the thing you would think when I say that. There's even an achievement for that, sort of. All that, though, brings us to the story of this game. As I mentioned, this is a direct sequel from High on Life 1, so I do have to give you a bit of background information. I believe this game is meant to be set about 5 years after that original title, but the simple gist of it is that you, in the first game, successfully saved humanity from what was known as the G3 cartel. You see, aliens invaded Earth, found out that humans were fantastic specimens for drug use by other aliens, and they started killing us en masse to do exactly that. You, a ne'er-do-well turned bounty hunter, managed to save the day by killing everyone involved, basically. This brought you a whole lot of fame, and you've been spending the last several years enjoying said fame. Except recently, your sisters run off and join some sort of terrorist cell, and eventually a bounty is put on her head. The catch here is you are a bounty hunter. You signed up with the bounty hunters as part of the first game, and it was kind of your whole thing. So when this bounty drops on your sister, you accept it in order to try to save her from the bounty hunters that are about to kill her. Unable to do so, however, you're forced to attack these bounty hunters if you want to continue the game, though there is a funny ending if you just shoot your sister in the face, as the game does have multiple endings. Assuming you want to play the rest of the game, however, once you save your sister, you'll quickly discover that the G3 cartel isn't truly gone. They've simply morphed into something known as Rhea Pharmaceuticals. Instead of trying to use humans illegally in a sort of drug and crime illicit manner, they've gone legit and turned the entire operation into a pharmaceutical company, basically trying to use humans as livestock in order to continue getting aliens high, but this time perfectly legally, which is exactly what your sister was fighting against, and you obviously want to stop that because there's an upcoming court date that is going to decide whether or not human beings are labeled as a livestock species, meaning that at that point there's nothing you can do to stop all of this. And so you become the villainous outlaw, tearing down Big Pharma as you try to put a stop to this entire thing. Now, honestly, pretty funny setup, and the game uses that situation and your fight against Big Pharma to make a whole bunch of jokes that, if that's your sense of humor, is extremely funny, and I personally enjoy that kind of thing, and I would say that's probably the best thing the game has going for it overall. However, it's not the only thing. You see, as you weave your way through this story, you're going to be taking down a bunch of these different targets. There's things like a murder mystery, or several trips to the mall even. The return of the various characters that were with you along the way, including your guns, the Gatlians, who are helping you out. However, how you treat all of these people and the exact actions you take do result in some funny situations, and I would hesitate to call them consequences because the outcome is largely the same. However, I would say there are some variations on the ending based on some of your exact choices, the things you do, etc. But it's all funneling you to the exact same place. There's not like entirely different story beats based off what you do. It can just alter the situation a bit. But one thing that I think that actually does for the story as a whole really is allows the game to be very reactive to the things you are doing, which I do think enhances the comedy aspect of this a great deal, because they are able to then, in real time with what you are doing, respond to it with, like, you know, the witty quips and this, that, and the other. I think it adds a lot of depth to the game that is easy to overlook, but is definitely something you can appreciate once you see it. All in all, though, the story is more or less what you did in the first game, with some slight variations on who you're fighting against, etc. But that does bring us to progression. So as you might have guessed from the fact that we are turned away from the bounty hunters, a lot of the stuff we had in the first game is no longer applicable to us. We don't have all our Gatlians, as they are sentient beings off doing their own thing in some cases. Our suit gets taken from us as well, and we're forced to don our outlaw clothes. transferring our pseudo operating system into our new suit as well. And this essentially acts as a bit of a progression reset where throughout the story you are going to pick up various guns and upgrades, typically from stores and or finding them in, I believe they're called lug boxes, like the game's chest. That's pretty much all there is to progression, however. That said, it's a little more interesting than that might initially sound because each new gun typically has some secondary property that allows you to interact with the environment in some way, and then the guns themselves are characters, which is really funny. Some of the new ones, like Travis and his wife Jan, which acts as your dual-wielding pistols, were really funny. You start with Travis, but then eventually pick up his wife for the dual-wield aspect of it, and I like those two a lot. But oftentimes, you'll find yourself going to the shops in each hub trying to track down some of these upgrades which become available as you progress through the story. Some of this is missable. However, luckily, this is an aspect of the game where you actually have the ability to recover some of that missable stuff. Once you start running through the story missions, which you cannot return to, the game is going to spawn in luglocks exterminators, basically people who can track down the chests for you. And this allows you to buy back the chests in an area that you did not find as part of the story. And while this won't fix the missable achievements for you, it does mean you can get the rewards still. So while there are various missable achievements and interactions, yes, you will still get the progression if you want to pony up some of the pesos for it. That, however, does bring us to the gameplay and world side of things. As I mentioned, this is primarily a hub system that then sees you sort of transitioning from the hubs that you are in into mission zones that you were only in for those missions. There are 3 large hubs, the main city, the harbor, as well as the zoo, each of which houses a bunch of content and just general exploration to get into. But the first thing I want to point out is that early on in the game you actually receive a skateboard. The skateboard becomes a sort of pillar of what this game is all about, both in terms of movement, combat, everything. To this end, it may not surprise you that a lot of these hubs are set up something akin to a skate park. There are literal skate parks in them that once you get so far into the story, you can start doing challenges at and collect skate letters. Those skate letters then allow you to upgrade your skateboard, which allows it to be even more effective in combat or exploration, etc. And so while it's definitely a comedy FPS, there's like a hint of old-fashioned skateboarding game in there as well, which I thought was honestly a pretty good time, more than you would probably expect. So that serves as sort of the basis for each individual hub outside of the aesthetics and the like. Now, as I've already mentioned, there are things around for us to collect, such as the various chests or lug boxes, and these contain all sorts of upgrades and collectibles for you. But getting them more often than not is going to require you to use your guns, allowing you to reach places you could not before. Alongside that, you got your, I would say, more expected activities. There are various races you can do with your skateboard, which are effectively like little time trials that you can perform through to either earn credits or just go after the achievement, I guess. There's also a returning theater where you can just watch full-on older movies in those theaters that have the normal runtime, though I will say the fact that the game crashes constantly does put a bit of a dampener on that. In the harbor area, there's also a guy you can find and help out once you have Travis and Jan that will actually give you a fishing rod, which allows you to go fishing and collect fish for your aquarium back home. There is a taxi minigame that you can find. Doing some of that stuff like fishing and performing the taxi services will put you into contact with some of the weird little ball guys that will actually then get you another weapon from your quarters as an example. So there's all sorts of little activities that feed into each other. And if you want, there's even other side activities like finding various game cartridges throughout the world, which lets you power up the arcade machines back at your quarters as well. And all of that sort of stuff is coupled and tinged with the game's sort of trademark humor that is certainly very crass. And while that's fun enough and will keep you exploring, I think each of the individual hubs are surprisingly more dense than you might necessarily expect. There's all sorts of little interactions you can find between the various people that you will find there. Each individual area typically also has some like one-off scripted moments as well, where you can rock up onto a location and then get involved in some activity there, like escape rooms or the comedy club. So there's a fair bit to do, even if it's not a terribly long game overall. But that does ultimately bring us to the combat system. Combat is interesting in the sense that it's a relatively simple concept overall, shoot things until they die, while trying not to die yourself if you'd believe it. There's a few other things to know as well. The biggest difference between this one and the first game is by far and away the skateboarding. Movement plays a much bigger role here than it did in the first game, and it wasn't nothing in the first game either, but the skateboard allows you to move around and grind and do do all sorts of tricks and maneuver around the battlefield. And once you start getting upgrades for your skateboard, you can even just full on use the skateboard as a weapon by jumping into people with it, things like that. And so while it's not like a cover-based shooter or anything, though you can certainly take cover to avoid fire, the bigger thing about it really is just move fast so as not to get hit or pinned down while taking out various enemies. So if you're into that style of gameplay, I would say you'd probably be more at home here than otherwise. You also have a shield mechanic as well. You're going to have that shield that enemies will eventually break through, but defeated enemies will typically drop shield charges that you can power it back up with, and then your health itself will actually restore itself over time. You've got the return of melee finishers with Knifey, of course, as well as some environmental things you can pick up, like flame-throwing turtles. Later on, there's these bugs that act as like a sort of cannon. Even much later on, actually, you also get access to like a little force push and pull type deal. And when you put all of that stuff together, I would say combat is pretty fun, but it's not challenging much at all. It's fun to engage with, but I mean, I would be surprised if anybody found any of this like difficult or any sort of sincere challenge or pushback from the enemies. And while there are different types of enemies, most of them are in fact just fodder, even on the higher difficulties where they die very, very quickly, with really only the actual boss fights and some of the very large enemies providing any real shakeup to your actual approach by just, being bigger bullet sponges, that type of thing. So when it comes to combat, movement's clearly the focus. If you lean into that, it can be a pretty fun experience. I just wouldn't expect much challenge from it. Which then brings us to the positives and negatives of this one. So by far and away, the biggest positive here really, or negative, I guess, depending on your stance for it, is the humor itself. I find the humor of this game extremely funny. I enjoy this type of thing, and so for me, that's a pretty big positive, and I think it's what sets a game like this apart from other games in the space. It also allows them to punctuate typical gaming things with just like little moments that make them memorable and will likely stick with you after you've played the game, and them leaning into expanding the gameplay elements from the first as well, like with the skateboard. It actually makes it really fun to run around the various hubs. It's clearly all set up with that skateboard in mind. It's a core part of the level design and traversal, and I think they did a really good job with that. It is a ton of fun to actually just do that stuff, and that's where this game is at its best, but there are some negatives. By far and away, the performance of this game is abysmal, to the point of simply being unacceptable, and it's a bit of a non-starter with everything else the game does or does not do well when the game is running really poorly for a lot of people. And while yes, I'm sure you can chalk up some of that to user error, even people like myself with specs that are above this game's even admittedly demanding recommended specs is still having issues with it. Another negative I have for this game is simply the lack of challenge. I do find that with humor games in particular, it works better if you are good at the type of gameplay experience you are trying to give. And while what's here is fun enough, another sort of comedy game I think you could point to is something like Another Crab's Treasure. I think that game works better than what it probably would otherwise, simply because it's also a pretty good Souls-like under the core of it. There are some challenging fights and things like that, and at least to me, High on Life 2 didn't really have that here. Like, the humor was fun, the gameplay was fun, and it would be, to my mind, a little better if the game would actually push back a little bit, outside of just, the witty one-liners, I guess. Not that it matters a bunch when, again, the game runs so poorly, which brings me to my conclusion. High on Life 2 is selling for $60 US here at launch, and while I think there is a fun enough experience there if you get to play it, it ultimately just has way too many technical problems to recommend in its current state. And while the game itself is funny and fun enough to play, the reality is that it's in a very poor technical state at the moment, and it's going to need some patches before I would recommend anybody purchase this, so I'm going to have to give it a wait for sale. I'd check in with this game probably a little later in the year, if anything, and see if they have fixed up some of the performance problems, while also trying to grab it on like a winter sale or something as an example would probably be the way to go here. But officially, I'd say wait for sale just because of how poorly the game is running, if nothing else. But that is going to do it for this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.